Hey guys, tonight we're heading straight into the bowels of medieval. Literally, you find yourself standing inside a massive stone castle. The wind howling past narrow slits in the wall, your breath misting in the air. It's frigid. Your fingers are already going numb, and yet, nature calls. You're led to a small chamber high up in the castle tower. There's no door, no privacy, and certainly no warmth. Just a stone bench with a hole in it. You shuffle over, your cloak, billowing in the draught, and lower yourself down. Your skin meets icy stone. That's when you realize medieval toilets weren't just primitive. They were downright punishing. And you probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake by the end, drop a comment with your location and local time. I always love seeing where and when you're watching from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're perched above the castle courtyard now, suspended over the void by nothing but a slab of stone and a rudimentary chute that disappears into the outer wall. That's the privy, the medieval toilet of choice for royalty and nobles. Some call it a garderobe, though technically that term also referred to a storage space for fine clothing. Why? Because people believed the rising ammonia from the latrines contents kept moths away. Yes, your silk tunics hung right beside the family toilet. You shift your weight on the bench. The seat is a little more than a carved opening, cold and hard, with no lid, no padding, and certainly no dignity. You try to ignore the damp smell wafting up, mixed with stone, moss, and centuries of unpleasant use. Outside, gulls scream as they circle the towers, and down below, a kitchen boy scrubs pots with slushy snow. This high-up placement wasn't for the view, it was about gravity. Waste would fall ideally down a vertical shaft to either a cesspit or directly into the moat. Below, in theory, this kept smells and mess away from living quarters. In practice, let's just say the wind wasn't always your friend. Sometimes things splattered, sometimes the chute jammed, and sometimes, in colder climates, the waste froze. Inside the shaft, like some grotesque medieval popsicle, castles built over rivers had it slightly better. The privy might empty into the flowing water, a medieval take on flushing. But many castles weren't built near water. Their solution, a murder hole of sorts, angled just enough to shoot waste out the wall. You really hoped no one was walking by underneath. If you were wealthy enough, you might have a wooden seat fitted into the stoner luxury feature. Some even had a bit of wool or moss for cushioning. Others had twin seats, side by side. Romantic, right? Nothing says true. Love like synchronized pooping. The most famous example might be the Great Hall Privy of Dover Castle. Historians still argue whether the waste from its royal garderobe dropped directly into the sea or into a cesspit tucked behind the outer wall. Either way, the smell was legendary. And yes, people still had to clean those pits by hand. Low-paid laborers or prisoners. Sometimes whole towers were built just for toilets called garderobe turrets. They'd jut out from the castle wall like little stone balconies. From the outside, they looked like birdhouses. From the inside, they were cold, cramped, and offered a real risk of falling if you leaned too far forward. Remember, these weren't just emergency stops. Nobles might spend half an hour in there, especially since many garderobes were conveniently placed near bedchambers or prayer rooms. People even conducted private conversations while squatting. The medieval throne, indeed, lighting. If you were lucky, there'd be a narrow slit in the wall to let in a little daylight. Otherwise, you did your business in near total darkness. And heaven help you if you dropped anything down the hole. Some did try to retrieve lost rings, coins, even manuscripts, though most never dared. One German bishop famously lost his life in the 12th century after falling into a cathedral privy. That's not an urban legend. He drowned in human waste. Now imagine winter. The stone seat is freezing. There's no insulation, no heating, and drafts come from every direction. You huddle in your cloak, trying not to touch the walls. The smell is worse in summer, but the discomfort peaks in January. And if the chute gets blocked, that's your squire's problem, or the Gong farmer's. More on him soon. There were attempts at comfort. Some castles had hanging cloths to block the breeze. Others placed privies in sunny spots to take the edge off. A few had sand or ash on the floor to absorb spills. But for all its grandeur, the medieval castles still struggled with the basics of bathroom design. You begin to realize how closely comfort and class were linked. To use a high stone toilet was a privilege. It meant you were far from the pit, the bucket, and the back alley. It also meant someone else had to deal with the aftermath. And as you rise, brushing off your cloak and stepping back into the corridor, you catch the faint echo of dripping water down the shaft behind you. A reminder that, in the medieval world, even royalty couldn't escape the realities of the human body. You leave the stone corridors of the castle behind, stepping out into the muddy lane of a small medieval village. It's early morning, and the sun hasn't quite cleared the thatched rooftops. Smoke trickles from chimneys. A pig trots lazily through the muck, and someone not far off is emptying a bucket with a dramatic splash. Now you're in the world of peasants, where the bathroom situation is somehow both simpler and far more chaotic. If you were a commoner in medieval Europe, chances are you didn't have a privy at all. Instead, you used whatever was available: a chamber pot under the bed, a latrine pit dug out back, or just a convenient corner of the garden if no one was looking. The phrase "to go to the jakes" became a common euphemism, though frankly, there wasn't always a jakes to go to. You glance to your left. A woman lifts her skirts, not bothering to leave the path, and squats with a practiced efficiency that comes from doing this her whole life. Her children wait nearby, chatting as if nothing unusual is happening, because to them it isn't. For rural peasants, sanitation was more about location and repetition than design. A basic toilet might be a pit covered with a few planks of wood, maybe with a rough seat carved in. These pits were shallow, often no more than a few feet deep, and not always covered once they were full. Sometimes they were left to rot in peace. Other times they were dug up for night soil, human waste used as fertilizer. Imagine that smell wafting across the cabbage patch. Inside peasant homes, chamber pots were the standard. These were made from ceramic, wood, or even metal if you were a little wealthier. They were kept under beds, under chairs, or in corners. After use, they'd be dumped outside, sometimes in a designated spot, but often just wherever seemed convenient. Into a ditch, behind the fence, over the neighbor's wall. There were laws against this in cities, but in rural areas, it was just part of the morning routine. And no, they didn't always aim very well. You pass a cottage where the mud around the doorway is darker than the rest. That's not water, that's repeated use. Some villagers had communal pits at the edge of town. Others just used the woods. One 14th century manual even advised digging a trench far from the well, and downwind, if possible, a rare burst of logic in a very messy time. Now you peek into a humble cottage. There's no plumbing, of course, just a bed, a hearth, and a chipped pot in the corner. A father hunches over the pot while his children pretend not to notice. There's no shame here, no door to lock. Privacy is a luxury the village doesn't afford, but there's also a sense of routine, a rhythm to the dirt. You'd learn, growing up, which corners to avoid and which trails smelled the worst in the afternoon sun. You'd know who dumped there, waste where, and you'd definitely learn to watch your step during spring rains, when pits overflowed and chamber pots leaked. This isn't to say peasants didn't try to stay clean. They did, in their way. Many washed with water from the well, used ash as a cleaning agent, or scrubbed with reeds. Latrine pits were sometimes treated with lime to keep down the smell and help decomposition. In especially neat villages, there might be community cleaning days, but even then, everything depended on habit, weather, and luck, and you weren't just dodging your own waste. Livestock shared the roads, chickens roosted under beds, dogs wandered freely, and pigs, they ate. Everything, yes, everything. It wasn't all bad. There's some charm here too. On cold nights, a warm chamber pot was oddly comforting. And since everyone smelled equally earthy, the standards of what was gross were very different. You didn't think of sanitation as a right. You thought of it as something nobles fussed over. Still, there were dangers. Poor sanitation led to constant outbreaks of disease. Dysentery was a part of life, especially among children, and in crowded cottages, with no separation between where you slept, ate, and went, contamination was inevitable. Historians still argue whether medieval communities understood germ theory in any form, or if they simply blamed bad smells, bad luck, or divine punishment. There's a fringe theory that some folk practices, like burying waste in ash or placing herbs in chamber pots, were early attempts at hygiene based on observation rather than science. Maybe they didn't know why, but they saw what worked. And speaking of what worked, not all chamber pots were equal. Some were hilariously decorative, with cheeky inscriptions like piss pot for the lazy or aim well, dear friend. Others were shaped like animals or had faces painted inside nothing, like squatting over a smiling monk at dawn. You leave the cottage now, stepping carefully around puddles. A cluster of children chase a goat down the lane, shrieking with laughter. One slips and falls into something he shouldn't have. He stands up with a scowl, flings a handful of muck at his brother, and runs off again. Just another day in the village. The truth is, for peasants, toilets weren't something you built, they were something you improvised, and maintained sort of, and dreaded, especially in winter. Still, as the day warms up and the smells grow stronger, you start to understand why even the poorest homes kept pots nearby, because going outside, barefoot, into the mud, isn't always worth it. The village disappears behind you as you tread uphill along a quiet, tree-lined path. The world shifts, bells chime in the distance. Birds flit between high stone walls. You pass beneath an arched gateway, and everything grows calmer, more orderly. You've entered a monastery. The air smells of damp earth, wax, and distant herbs. Somewhere, someone is chanting. The gravel crunches underfoot as you follow a stone path toward a long rectangular building connected to the dormitories. No doors, no locks, just a low entrance and a long row of arched openings. This, dear traveller, is the monk's communal latrine. You duck inside. It's dim, cool, and hushed. A gentle stream of water flows beneath your feet in a stone channel. Above it, spaced at intervals along a continuous wooden bench, are holes. No partitions, no curtains. Just an unbroken row of quiet, contemplative toilet seats. Monks did everything in silence, including their bathroom trips. You can only imagine the soundscape. Robes rustling, quiet grunts, the occasional cough echoing off the stone, and the steady trickle of water flowing underneath, to carry the waste away. It's strangely serene. This wasn't a crude arrangement. Medieval monasteries were among the most organized institutions in Europe, and their toilet systems reflected that. Many were positioned over natural streams, cleverly diverted through the building to rinse the waste into a river or pond beyond. Others used rainwater collection systems. It wasn't quite plumbing, but it was plumbing adjacent. Historians still argue whether some monasteries had wooden chutes to divide waste, or if the flow was completely open. There's even debate about whether they used ash, straw, or special herbs to keep the smell down. But there's no doubt that the reredorter was a marvel of monastic engineering, simple, durable, and astonishingly clean by medieval standards. Of course, that's assuming everyone followed the rules. You glance toward the far end of the latrine, where a wooden sign once warned of penalties for soiling the benches or not washing afterward. Not everyone was wholly about hygiene. One surviving monastery regulation from the 13th century explicitly forbids laughing, talking, or making rude noises while on the latrine. Evidently, monks are still human, and not just human resourceful. In cold weather, monks sometimes lined their seats with wool. In larger monasteries, there were scheduled times for latrine visits. Bells would ring, and entire rows of monks would shuffle in, robes held high, in solemn formation. For many, it was the only time during the day they had some form of rest sitting down, even if only for a moment. Oddly enough, the latrine also served as a kind of social equalizer. The abbot and the youngest novice used the same row of holes. There was no luxury stall, no gilded seat, just wood, stone, and the running stream beneath. And unlike castles, there were no private garderobes, except maybe one for the infirmary. As you sit on one of the ancient wooden benches, you realize that the monk's relationship to bodily functions was both pragmatic and theological, was linked to purity, and bowel troubles were seen not as weaknesses, but as tests of discipline. Some monasteries even had designated toilet monitors. Yes, a real role who ensured everything stayed clean and in good working order. One quirky tidbit comes to mind. In a few monastic traditions, monks were expected to memorize psalms or quietly pray while relieving themselves. You imagine trying to recite scripture while shivering over a stream of icy water, knees shaking, hoping Brother Thomas isn't peeking. The water itself came from elaborate systems of pipes, some carved from lead, others from hollowed-out logs. In Cluny Abbey in France, the monks had one of the most advanced sanitation setups in Europe. The reredorter was connected to bathhouses, gardens, even fish ponds. Wastewater was channeled away in layers, with filtration systems that scholars still admire today. Yet even here, problems cropped up. When a stream dried, the smell became unbearable. When pipes froze, waste backed up. And when too many monks ate the same bad lentil stew. Well, let's just say the reredorter saw heavy traffic. You shuffle forward along the bench, tracing the smooth groove worn into the wood by centuries of monkish bottoms. A thought lingers. These spaces were not just toilets. They were part of a rhythm. Eat, pray, copy manuscripts, go to the It was all part of the holy life. One surviving, drawing from a medieval manuscript, shows a line of monks approaching the latrine, each carrying a little bundle of twigs, probably for wiping. No toilet paper here, just bundles of nature, carefully chosen. Some even preferred small stones, rinsed in the stream afterward. There's something endearing about it, if a bit scratchy. And then, as you step back into the sunlight, you realize monastic toilets weren't just practical, they were sacred in their own strange way. Orderly, communal, free from the chaos of the peasant's pit or the castle's drafty chute. They were the quiet bathroom of God's servants. You pause, listening once more to the quiet water beneath your feet. The monks are already returning to their work, illuminating texts, tending herbs, chanting through their headaches. And somewhere, a novice hurries toward the latrine with a pained expression. Some things never change. The monastery fades behind you as the air grows heavier, denser with the mingled sense of humanity. You've reached the outskirts of a bustling medieval town. It's twilight now, and the streets are thin in except for one figure hunched beneath a bundle of leather and rags, trudging through a narrow alley with a lantern in one hand and a long-handled shovel in the other. This is the Gong farmer, and tonight he's going to work. The title sounds oddly mystical, Gong meaning dung or waste in Middle English, but there's nothing poetic about what he does. His job: climb down into the foul-smelling pits beneath public latrines, dig through the contents with his bare hands if needed, and haul it all away. And yes, this was an actual profession, a vital one. You follow him through a wooden gate into the yard behind a tavern. A large wooden seat sits over a sunken pit. The lid creaks as he lifts it, and a wave of unimaginable stench hits you. You gag. He doesn't even flinch. He's used to it. He lowers himself slowly down into the darkness, balancing on a ladder slick with you don't want to know. By law, Gong farmers usually worked at night. It wasn't just tradition, it was necessity. The stench would be unbearable in the heat of day, and no one wanted to watch their bodily secrets being carted past their door. City councils often restricted their hours to prevent offense to decent society. Despite their low social status, Gong farmers earned surprisingly good wages. The job was so dangerous and revolting that cities had to pay well to keep someone willing. Some even grew wealthy, though they rarely stayed rich. Most didn't live long enough to enjoy their earnings. The risks were real. Suffocation was a common hazard. Without proper ventilation, methane buildup in cesspits could knock a man unconscious or worse. One 14th century account describes two Gong farmers who passed out and drowned in their own workplace. The third man in their crew climbed down to save them. He didn't come back up either. You stand near the lip of the pit now, watching as the Gong farmer fills his leather bucket, hoists it up, and dumps the contents into a wooden barrel lined with straw. It sloshes with a sickening squelch. That barrel, by the way, isn't just tossed out. It has a destination, the edge of town, or sometimes beyond, where human waste is repurposed as fertilizer. Yes, there was a thriving night soil economy. This waste, if cured properly with thyme, ash, or lime, could be spread over fields to enrich the soil. Some landlords even made side income leasing, cesspit access to local farmers. You may shovel from my latrine corner, but leave enough for next season. Imagine negotiating that lease. Historians still debate whether this practice improved agriculture or just moved disease from one place to another. Some believe it was useful and relatively safe with proper composting. Others argue it fueled outbreaks of parasites and cholera, though germ theory was centuries away. And then there's the black market side of things. Not all waste was properly aged. Some was stolen, yes, stolen from private pits and sold to desperate farmers in lean years. There were even arguments over who owned the waste. A man in York sued his neighbour in 1428 for stealing the contents of his privy. The court records are both hilarious and deeply unfortunate. You trail the Gong farmer now as he pushes a cart laden with barrels through the crooked lanes. People make way, holding handkerchiefs to their faces. A few gag. Others ignore him entirely. His clothes are crusted. His beard is matted. But he carries himself with a weary dignity. He knows they need him more than they care to admit. In some towns, like London, Gong farmers were issued official licenses. They had guilds, rules, uniforms of a sort. They were even excused from certain laws due to the nature of their work, like walking through alleys at night or carrying blades to cut through frozen muck. But most still lived on the margins, both socially and geographically. At home, they were avoided. Many couldn't marry. Some were barred from churches. One chronicler noted that a Gong farmer's family had to sit alone at Mass, lest their odour disturb the faithful. Yet these were the people keeping medieval cities barely livable. As he rounds a corner, a group of children jeer and throw pebbles at his cart. He ignores them. Later, one of those same children will slip on a dung-slick street and learn a valuable lesson about irony. And here's the strangest part. Despite the filth, the danger, the stink, some men did this work for decades. One man in London served as a Gong farmer for 33 years. When he died, his tools were passed down, shovel, hook, and boots. There's even a fringe theory among some scholars that Gong farmers were occasionally paid extra to retrieve valuables, rings, even lost documents that had accidentally been flushed away. Some wore gloves. Most didn't. You watch now as tonight's waste barrels are emptied into a field outside town. The smell drifts with the wind. A farmer stands nearby, nodding in satisfaction. It's all part of the cycle. The Gong farmer rests his hands on his hips, his face unreadable in the flickering lantern light. He'll be back tomorrow, and the day after. Because no matter how advanced the world becomes, someone still has to shovel the filth. And tonight, that someone just trudged quietly into the dark. The stench of the Gong farmer's cart lingers in your nostrils as you slip deeper into the winding guts of a medieval city. It's early evening now. Lanterns flicker in windows. A baker sweeps crumbs from his stall. Cats prowl beneath carts. And somewhere splash a chamber. Pot is emptied with all the ceremony of a sneeze. You jump back just in time. This is public sanitation. Medieval style. A symphony of filth, improvised with every drop. Cities grew faster than they could clean themselves. And that meant toilets, if you could even call them that, popped up in every alley, courtyard, and creaking building corner. You pass a tenement house, 4 stories high, wooden beams leaning like tired shoulders. Dozens live inside, maybe hundreds. There's no central plumbing, no assigned latrines, just chamber pots, and when they fill, out the window they go. Some towns had laws. In Paris, you were supposed to shout "Gardes low" before tossing waste into the street. In London, it was where below. But let's be honest, people rarely warned. Or if they did, it was mid-splash. Now, imagine this. Narrow, cobbled streets, high buildings, and windows above you on both. Sides, every evening becomes a lottery of dodging buckets. Some medieval citizens even carried cloaks with hoods large enough to double as waist shields. Not kidding, public latrines did exist. In busier towns, you might find a privy house, a shared wooden structure over a pit, often built near rivers or drainage ditches. A handful had basic stalls or dividers, but most were open bench affairs, elbow to elbow with strangers. You duck into one now. It's a plank of wood stretched over a trench, the air thick with the scent of centuries. Someone's carved their name into the wall. Someone else left behind what can only be described as art. There's no light, and no one speaks. You sit beside a man who's quietly eating an onion, yes, while relieving himself. Public latrines were rarely cleaned. The waste might be carted away now and then, but often it just built up. One London privy pit, excavated by archaeologists, was over 6 feet deep, full of bones, buttons, seeds, and other historical mysteries. You imagine sitting above that with a wooden seat between you and eternity. And here's the kicker: some people preferred not to use them. They were so foul, so unsafe, that many city dwellers chose alleyways instead. You wander through one now a tight corridor between 2 bakeries. It reeks of urine. The walls are slick. In the shadows, you spot a man relieving himself against a post, humming. In some cities, local governments tried to fight back. Wooden boards were placed over gutters to keep waste out. Public scolders were hired to catch and fine those who dumped refuse illegally. Town criers would announce new sanitation rules, but enforcement was patchy. When someone's been dumping their pot out the window for 40 years, a parchment fine isn't going to change much. And let's not forget the animals. Horses clopped by with loose bowels. Dogs wandered freely. Geese shockingly aggressive once defended corners that doubled as communal urinals. And pigs. Pigs were little sanitation tanks on hooves, eating anything and everything. Some towns banned them, most didn't. After all, they were the only ones cleaning up. There were occasional bright spots. Some public latrines were attached. 2 bathhouses or guild halls maintained by fees. In Lübeck, Germany, a latrine over a canal was built with elaborate woodwork and stone supports. Historians still argue whether it was reserved for merchants or just unusually fancy. Either way, it flushed directly into the river, as so many did. Yes, the rivers. Let's pause for a moment and picture that. A winding city river, once blue and fish-filled, now black and sluggish. 1,000 privies emptying into it. Buckets, pots, gutters all feeding the current. Children still play by the edge. Women still wash clothes upstream. One man even fishes. Brave soul, you pass a bridge. Now, and beneath it, there's a toilet stall built right into the wall. Some called them hanging privies. From above, it looks like a small wooden cabinet. From below, it looks like a nightmare. Rain or shine, waste drops straight into the water. The bridge has become a sewer and a sidewalk in one, and then there's the night. At night, streets turn treacherous. Without lanterns, the filth is invisible. You walk carefully, picking your way around slippery patches. Step wrong, and your boot sinks into something squelchy. You hope it's just mud. You really, really hope. And yet, somehow, life continues. People laugh. They trade gossip beside the public latrine. Children race chamber pots down the gutter. Like boats, one woman runs a little side business, selling lavender sprigs to tuck behind your ears. blocks the worst of it. She claims you begin to realize that for all its mess, medieval city life had its own rhythm. A tolerance for stink, a gallows humor, a resilience in the face of bodily chaos. People lived in this muck and somehow found joy anyway, even if they had to dodge flying chamber pots to do it. You've made it this far, narrowly dodging flying chamber pots, trudging through manure-streaked alleys, and politely ignoring the onion-eating man in the public latrine. But now comes a question you've been trying not to think about. What did they use to wipe? You glance down at your hands, suddenly very aware of your thumbs. Because, spoiler alert, medieval toilet paper wasn't a thing. Not unless you were incredibly rich, or incredibly lucky. Let's start with the peasants. If you were a farmer, a laborer, or a street vendor with more calluses than coins, you used whatever was on hand, literally. Leaves were the most obvious choice, assuming it was the right season. Broad ones worked best. Stinging nettles were discouraged. In winter, when greenery was scarce, folks turned to straw, moss, bits of fabric, or hay. Moss was considered the premium choice, oft abundant in damp places, and surprisingly absorbent. Straw, on the other hand, was scratchy and had a troubling tendency to poke where it wasn't welcome. Ceramic shards called tersoria were used by some Roman-influenced communities and likely survived in niche use in early medieval regions. These were smooth, curved tiles, shaped vaguely like tongue depressors. You'd rinse and reuse them, sort of a terrifying communal squeegee. Some towns even placed bundles of cloth rags near public latrines. These would be soaked in water or vinegar, used, and then returned to the bucket for the next visitor. Yes, returned, no. There was no bleach, but by far the most widespread method, especially in warmer regions and Islamic areas, was simple. Water, pour, rinse, and dry. It was cleaner, more sustainable, and, well, sensible. The trick was availability. If there was a stream nearby, you were in luck. If not, you made do with a jug or your cupped hands. Which brings us to the infamous left-hand custom. In many parts of the medieval world, including North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Spain and southern Italy, the left hand was designated for cleaning, while the right was reserved for eating, greeting, and writing. This created a social code so strong that offering food or a handshake with your left hand was deeply offensive. Even in Northern Europe, though the practice wasn't formalized, there was a quiet understanding that certain tasks were handled with one hand only. And if you were caught eating with the wrong hand in mixed company, expect a few suspicious glances. Among the wealthy, options improved slightly. Rich nobles might use scraps of linen or wool torn from worn garments. Some carried small cloths tucked into their belts for the occasion. One 14th century inventory from a minor French noblewoman lists a pouch containing wiping cloths. Neatly folded, there's no further detail. We're grateful, in monasteries, bundles of twigs or soft wood shavings were sometimes provided, along with bowls of clean water. Monks were expected to wash thoroughly and sometimes even recorded their own bowel habits in health logs. A good movement, after all, was seen as a sign of spiritual and physical balance. Still, you shudder to imagine the splinters. There are even written accounts of aristocrats using feathers ostrich, if you were especially regal, or silk scraps soaked in rosewater. These weren't for everyday use, mind you, more like ceremonial wiping. Maybe after a particularly royal bowel movement, and toilet paper, not really a thing. Not until much, much later. Some Chinese dynasties, were reportedly manufacturing early paper wipes as far back as the 6th century, but it didn't make its way to Europe in meaningful quantities until long after the Middle Ages. So, back to you, huddled in a medieval outhouse in mid-November. You've just done your business. Your chamber pot is full. You reach for the wiping bundle, hoping the frost hasn't stiffened the moss too much. There's no privacy, no warmth, and definitely no two-ply. Now let's talk consequences. Poor wiping materials combined with limited washing meant constant skin irritation. Rashes, sores, and infections were part of the package. And hemorrhoids. Oh, the hemorrhoids. One medieval physician wrote a 40-page treatise on anal discomfort. His advice: sit less, pray more, and use soft things. Historians still debate whether wiping habits varied more by region or class. Was moss more common in Britain and hay more common in France? Did nobles wipe more often or just more luxuriously? There's evidence, but not enough to be sure. What we do know is that wiping wasn't something you discussed openly. It was personal, humble, and occasionally traumatic. Some fringe sources even claim that people used old pages from manuscripts, especially discarded religious texts or out-of-date sermons. But this is mostly rumor, since parchment was too valuable to waste. Paper, when it arrived, was used first for writing, not wiping. That said, there is a 15th century English poem that references a man wiping with wisdom, which may have been a sarcastic jab at someone using sermons for less than holy purposes. As you step out of the latrine, wiping hand respectfully tucked away, you catch the scent of rosemary. A nearby apothecary is selling sachets of dried herbs, lavender, mint, thyme. People tied them to their belts or held them to their noses to counteract the public reek. One customer jokes that it's to hide the smell of bad wiping. The apothecary does not laugh, and as the sun sets over the rooftops, you find yourself walking with a new kind of awareness. You notice what people carry: cloths, jugs, folded leaves. You wonder which hand they're favoring. You notice where they hesitate to sit, because once you've spent a day in the Middle Ages, you start to see the world not by what's clean, but by what's barely tolerable. The night deepens, and the torchlight flickers along the uneven cobbles as you follow the sway of heavy skirts rustling ahead. You're shadowing a woman, now a merchant's wife, perhaps, or a washerwoman on her way home. She walks with purpose, even grace, though her long gown brushes dangerously close to every puddle and pile in the road. And you begin to wonder, what was it like, going to the toilet as a woman in the Middle Ages? Short answer: complicated. Long answer: let's begin with modesty, mud, and very inconvenient fabric. You see, medieval clothing wasn't exactly designed for speed or discretion. Women wore layers: a chemise, one or two kirtles, perhaps a surcoat, and always that sweeping outer gown. Not to mention belts, aprons, veils, and in colder months, heavy wool cloaks. So when the need to relieve yourself struck, especially in public, faced a strategic battle with gravity and modesty. But here's a surprising truth: under all that fabric, medieval women were actually more flexible than you might think. Unlike modern underwear, medieval women often wore no underpants at all, especially among the lower classes. This meant that, with enough practice, you could squat quickly and efficiently without removing much clothing at all. Just lift the layers, aim carefully, and let the skirt do the modesty work for you. The fabric acted like a tent, shielding you from view. Ingenious, if not exactly glamorous. You find yourself ducking behind a baker's stall now, Following the whisper of footsteps, a woman has slipped into a quiet alley. She lifts her skirts with a practiced flick, squats low, and relieves herself onto the packed earth. It's done in seconds. She wipes with a bundle of moss from her pouch, drops it, and walks away. No one bats an eye. But this freedom was often reserved for poorer women, those used to making do in public spaces. For wealthier women, things were trickier. Privacy was everything. And in castles, manor houses, or even urban residences, that meant chamber pots. Lots of chamber pots, one by the bed, one by the stairs, one tucked behind a curtain in the great hall. These weren't hidden away, they were part of the household rhythm. And if you were a noblewoman, you likely didn't carry your own. A servant, called a chepara, might bring you a warmed seat or hold up your gown while you perched and peed in some cases. Noblewomen even had portable stools, small wooden chairs with holes in the center, placed over a ceramic bowl. You'd sit like royalty, quite literally, and someone else would clean up afterward. It's said that Eleanor of Aquitaine travelled with her own padded latrine seat, lined with linen and stuffed with herbs. A woman of refinement. Still, even for the rich, there were no flushing systems. Waste had to be carried away. If you were lucky, the castle had a garderobe. If you weren't, your pot went out the window. But for all women, rich or poor, one issue remained the same. Where do you go when you're out? Public latrines were often dominated by men. In cities, the stalls were shared, open, and dangerously close to the street. For women, using them meant braving stairs, gropes, or worse. Many avoided them altogether. Instead, women learned the city's secrets, the quiet alleys, the dark corners behind churches, the stairwells beneath bridges. These were unofficial women's toilets, known only to those who needed them most. A sort of whispered map, passed from mother to daughter in busy marketplaces. Some entrepreneurial souls even provided makeshift solutions, a bucket behind a curtain for a few coins. Others sold perfumed cloths for aftercare, or bundles of lavender to hold near your face while you squatted near an open drain. Luxury, medieval dash style. And, of course, there was the fear of being seen. Modesty wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. A woman caught relieving herself in public risked shame, punishment, even accusations of indecency. One city law in 14th century Prague fined women for squatting with exposure of thighs, not for the act but for the visibility. It tells you everything about priorities. Still, some women found ways to cope. Long skirts, as inconvenient as they were, offered privacy. Wide cloaks could double as privacy screens, and groups of women might guard each other, one standing lookout while the other did her business. You pass such a pair now, tucked between two stairwells, chatting like nothing is amiss. Wiping, too, presented extra challenges. Without undergarments, you had more freedom but less fabric to absorb anything afterward. Wealthy women used linen scraps, rosewater-soaked cloths, or even feathers. Poorer women, again, made do with moss or leaves, and some simply used their hands, washing afterward with water from a jug they carried. And then there was the risk of accidents. Imagine navigating a busy city street while wearing 15 pounds of fabric, with nowhere to go and no time to find it. Accidents happened, often a leaked bladder, a soiled hem. These were part of the reality of womanhood, which is likely why skirts were dark, cloaks were heavy, and no one ever questioned the faint smell of ammonia on laundry day. Pregnant women faced extra hurdles. swollen bellies, aching joints, and a sudden need to goffen. Some midwives taught posture tricks to relieve pressure. Others simply carried their own chamber pots in baskets. In some texts, you'll even find references to birthing stools that doubled as toilets, practical, unnerving, necessary. There's one particularly quirky tidbit. In some noble houses, women were said to own embroidered chamber pots. Yes, embroidered. The cloth covers would be decorated with initials, flowers, or pious verses. One example from Burgundy includes a stitched line reading, "Clean hands, clean heart." The irony was probably unintentional. You pass a laundry line now, where linens dry in the breeze. Among them hang folded cloths, darker near the edges. No one says what they're for. Everyone knows. As you walk on, you begin to notice the subtle choreography of women navigating public space, how they adjust their cloaks, how they step over gutters, how they carry small jugs, bundles of herbs, or pouches of moss. There's dignity here, even in filth, because no matter how inconvenient the skirts, or how scarce the privacy, medieval women still found ways to care for themselves, to carve out moments of cleanliness in a world that rarely offered it. The morning bells chime again, and with them comes a new day and a new level of toilet trouble. You've left the merchant towns behind, turned your back on castles, alleyways, and monasteries, and now you're deep in the countryside. Fields stretch wide and golden, interrupted only by the slow plod of oxen and the squat stone houses of isolated farmsteads. You hear the creak of a wooden cart, the crow of a rooster, and somewhere nearby the unmistakable splash of someone emptying their chamber pot into a ditch. Again, it's not glamorous, but here, far from city laws or monastic order, people do what they must, and that includes building their own toilets. So let's talk about the medieval pit latrine. It's exactly what it sounds like, a hole in the ground, sometimes shallow, sometimes impressively deep, depending on soil, tools, and motivation. Over it, you might find a few planks of wood. If the family had time or a skilled neighbor, little shack might be built on top. Nothing fancy. A lean-to with a gap in the roof and a door that doesn't quite shut. You're invited inside one now. The floor creaks. The walls are made of rough timber, patched with moss to keep the wind out. There's a bench along one side with a circular hole cut in, dark and mysterious. Beneath it, you can just make out the shifting mound below. It bubbles faintly. You decide not to look too long. This latrine belongs to a farming family, passed down with the land. Once a year, twice, if they're organized, they dig a new pit, move the shack over it, and cover the old one with earth. Sometimes they plant herbs or fruit trees on top. One old superstition even claimed that plum trees grown over rested earth bore sweeter fruit. You choose not to test that theory. Out here, there's no sanitation crew, no Gong farmers. The family handles the waste themselves, or lets it rot naturally. Some dig long trenches and move along them slowly, like a very slow-moving toilet parade. These latrines were a compromise better than going in the woods, safer than a chamber pot, but still far from clean. Insects buzz, flies swarm, and in summer, the smell is something you can only describe as sticky. Still, the privacy was a gift. No jostling elbows, no bridge traffic, just you, the wind, and the pit. But of course, not everyone had one. Many peasant homes were just single-room cottages. If it was raining, or if wolves were rumored nearby, you simply used a pot inside. That pot might then be emptied onto the garden, behind a hedge, or into a nearby stream. It wasn't ideal, it wasn't sanitary, but it was normal. Children, meanwhile, were a different story. Toddlers squatted where they stood. Parents taught them early to avoid the hearth and the straw mattress. Some families even designated a special pea corner in the cottage, usually near the back wall, where a stone slab or packed clay could absorb the worst of it. Accidents weren't a crisis. They were just cleaned with ash and moved on from. In some parts of rural France and England, communal latrines were shared between 2 or 3 families. They'd take turns digging, maintaining, and checking the depth, which was code for figuring out when to move the shack. No one wanted that job, and yet everyone took a turn. Interestingly, some of these farm latrines were built next to animal pens. Pigs and chickens would scavenge for waste and leftover scraps, creating a crude sort of compost system. You peek into one now, and a pig blinks back at you with ancient judgment. It knows what you've done. One fringe theory among environmental historians suggests that these mixed-used waste systems animals, compost, pit helped rural communities manage disease better than crowded cities. But others argue the opposite, pointing to parasites, groundwater contamination, and the horrifying number of children who fell into open pits. Yes, it happened. You trudge around the back of a barn where a second, smaller latrine has been built for the field workers. It's nothing more than a raised plank over a ditch. No walls, no roof, just a place to squat with a view of the cows. Somehow, it still feels more dignified than a city gutter. Rural toilets were often treated with natural materials. Ash, lime, or even sawdust helped suppress the smell and absorb liquid. These materials were raked in daily, not for comfort, mind, but to keep the flies down and the mud from becoming soup. A well-run farm had a rhythm, and the latrine was part of it. Wake, eat, relieve, work, repeat, at night, though the story changes. Without lanterns, the yard is pitch black. Wolves howl in the distance. Wind shakes the trees. You, half asleep and chilly, must decide, do you brave the path to the shack? Or do you use the pot under the bed and risk a spill? You choose the pot. Of course you do, it's cold. The seat is wood, cracked and smooth from years of use. You perch, balancing awkwardly as you hold a cloth to your nose. Outside the barn, creaks. Inside, someone snores. And you realize this, right here, is the most peaceful moment of your medieval day. There's no luxury here, no scented candles, but there is quiet, routine, a kind of private dignity born of repetition. And as you slide back into bed, pulling a scratchy wool blanket to your chin, you hear a distant voice murmur, I think it's time to dig a new pit. Tomorrow, and just like that, sleep comes. You wake to the sound of distant hoofbeats and the squeak of wooden wheels. The countryside is behind you now. You're on the move, bumping along a muddy road in a cramped wagon beside sacks of barley, a loud goat, and a merchant who smells faintly of pickled onions. Travel in the Middle Ages wasn't for the faint of heart, and neither was relieving yourself on the road, because here's the thing no illuminated manuscript ever bothers to depict. Everyone, from peasant to noble, eventually had to pee. And when you're halfway between 2 villages with no inn in sight, the question becomes, where? The wagon creaks to a stop. The merchant climbs down, stretches, and disappears behind a bush with all the ceremony of a man who's done this many, many times. You follow suit, wandering off the path toward a thicket. The undergrowth squelches beneath your boots. You crouch, and just as you begin, a bird shrieks overhead, and you nearly topple sideways. No walls, no privacy. Just you, the bushes, and the eternal hope that no one is approaching on horseback. It wasn't just awkward, it could be dangerous. Travel toilets were not a given. Unless you brought a pot with you or stayed at a monastery where facilities existed, you relied on nature. And that meant exposure to wild animals, robbers, or worse yet, nobles, who didn't want you squatting near their hedges. For women, it was doubly risky. Long skirts made squatting easier to hide but harder to perform quickly. Many traveled in groups for safety and had pre-agreed pause spots along the road. Sometimes these were marked trees. Other times, just a flat rock someone remembered from a previous journey. You reach one such spot, now a hollow between two stones with trampled grass all around. Clearly, many bladders have found relief here now, if you were lucky enough to travel with a wagon or cart. You might have a chamber pot tucked into your supplies. They were made of ceramic, metal, or even wood, and travelers would empty them at the next stream. If you were wealthy, a servant took care of this chore. If not, well, add it to your long list of indignities. Some inns did offer privies, though. Offered might be generous. You duck into one now attached to the side of a roadside alehouse. It's dark, damp, and smells like something crawled in and gave up centuries ago. A stone bench has a hole in the middle, under which you can just make out the slosh of accumulated filth. A spider watches you from the ceiling, probably judging your form. There's no water, no towel. You wipe with a square of old fabric nailed to the wall. You choose not to think about how often it's reused. Still, this was better than nothing. Rural inns, especially in England and France, were required to maintain some kind of toilet area. Not out of kindness, out of disease prevention. Even medieval authorities understood that travelers constantly relieving themselves near the food cart wasn't ideal, but enforcement was uneven. Some inns had decent latrines with flowing water. Others simply pointed to the hedge behind the stable and said good luck. There's even record of a few inns offering to holes one for guests, one for staff, but in practice, everyone used the same seat. On longer journeys, people got creative. Pilgrims to holy sites often carried portable chamber pots called pilgrim flasks when repurposed. These could be emptied into ditches or streams along the way. Wealthier travelers commissioned comfort stools, wooden chairs with lids, designed for roadside use. One particularly enthusiastic bishop allegedly had his comfort stool padded with wool and lined with linen. Changed daily. Not to be outdone, royal caravans often traveled with entire wagons devoted to toilet logistics. These nests included covered tents with padded seats, full-time servants for cleaning, and even perfumed cloths. Queen Isabella of France reportedly refused to travel without hers. Historians still argue whether traveling nobles actually used these elaborate setups or simply stopped their entire caravan to relieve themselves behind a tree like everyone else. Some records suggest they did both, using the comfort stool during bad weather and the forest edge when in a hurry, of course. Travel toilets weren't always simple. Consider bridges. In many regions, bridges doubled as relief points. Some had built-in stalls hanging over the water. Others were simply used unofficially. You cross one now a narrow wooden structure with stone foundations. At the far end, a low platform juts out just far enough to suggest purpose. Someone is already there, facing the river, humming. But rivers weren't always ideal. In dry months, they stagnated. In rainy seasons, they flooded. And if you relieved yourself upstream of a village's laundry spot, you might earn yourself a very angry reception. Meanwhile, forests provided cover, but came with their own dangers: thorns, wolves, bandits, and the ever-present possibility of stepping in someone else's business. You learn this the hard way. Still, people adapted. Some carried sticks to poke the grass before squatting. Others traveled with shoes that could be rinsed easily. You pass one old man who's tied herbs to his belt and claims it keeps the flies off the important bits. You don't ask what bits he means. Night travel was the worst. Without moonlight, roads were perilous. Stopping to relieve yourself meant stepping into utter darkness, hoping you didn't back into a ditch or offend a passing spirit. Many travelers chose to hold it through entire nights, leading to bloated bladders and terrible sleep. There's one recorded case of a merchant who traveled with a padded cloak that could be turned into a blanket, tent, and portable urinal. He refused to explain how. The cloak mysteriously vanished from inventories after his death. And then there's you. You squat behind a bush on the edge of a field, watching the stars shimmer above as the goat in the wagon bleats mournfully in the distance. You wipe with a dry leaf. You stand. You feel more connected to history than you ever expected, because travel, then as now, wasn't just about where you were going. It was also about where you'd stop. When nature called, the sun has set again. You're resting now if you can. Call it that. Tin a castle courtyard, wrapped in a rough wool blanket, nestled near the kitchen hearth. The air smells of smoke, stew, and damp stone. Footsteps echo overhead, and somewhere in the darkness, you hear it, the unmistakable creak and splash of someone using the garderobe. Castles didn't use outhouses. They had indoor toilets of their own kind. The word garderobe might sound fancy, even fashionably, literally means guarding one's robes. But rest assured, no garments are being protected here. You rise, clutching a candle, and climb a narrow spiral stairwell. At the end of a cold stone corridor is a small wooden door. It opens into a chamber barely wider than your shoulders. There's a stone bench, a hole in the middle, and a chilling breeze that tells you this latrine is open to the air. You look down. Far, far below is the moat, or a pit, or the side of the castle wall. That's right, medieval castles often built their toilets directly into the outer walls. Perched above sheer drops, waste would fall into cesspits, moats, or just the open earth. Some even angled their chutes, so it slid down the side of the wall like a horrible water feature. Practical, yes. Pretty, not remotely. This was the castle's answer to sanitation. Gravity, you go, it falls. You close the door. End of story. Some garderobes were elaborate, carved. Stone, private doors, niches for candles, even small windows for ventilation. Rich lords had them connected to their bedchambers. One particularly grand example in Dover Castle has twin seats so you and your closest friend could enjoy some quality time. Others were much rougher. A wooden seat, a rope for wiping, and an open shaft to nowhere. You hope it's a dry season, or the splash zone might be higher than expected. And here's a curious tidbit. The air in garderobes was often so bad that some believed it killed fleas and lice. Knights would hang their cloaks in these chambers overnight to fumigate them. Yes, literal poo closets were considered pest control. It was less lavender sachet and more biohazard chic. Back in the great hall, servants still scurry about. Their route takes them past the garderobe tower, and you notice something strange. They all avoid it. That's because, despite being indoors, garderobes were dangerous. The chutes sometimes clogged. Methane gas built up in the shafts. If you dropped your candle, the whole column could ignite like a chimney. There are records of garderobes exploding. Yes, exploding. Nothing ends. A feast quite like a flaming toilet. You approach another chamber, now this one reserved for servants. It's little more than a seat over a stone pipe, connected to the same outer chute. It stinks of mildew and iron. You imagine using it at night, in winter, in the dark. Suddenly, chamber pots seem more appealing. Speaking of which, chamber pots remained crucial even in castles. After all, who wants to climb 5 flights of stairs at 3 a.m. in chainmail? Most nobles kept a pot beside their bed. In the morning, servants emptied it into the moat or down the garderobe. The richer the castle, the more servants you had handling your excrement. A strange measure of power. One noblewoman reportedly had 3 chambermaids whose sole job was to clean and perfume her toilet equipment. Their wages were recorded alongside her falconers, and it wasn't just people using these systems. Kitchen waste, bath water, and laundry runoff all went down the same chutes. The moat became a foul stew of rotting meat, human waste, dead animals, and whatever else the castle wanted to forget. Swimming was not advised. You peer over the edge of one garderobe now, and the wind rushes past your face like a warning. The shaft is slick with green moss. You see bones at the bottom animal, hopefully, and then you spot a glint, coins. It happened more often than you'd think. Purses slipped from belts. Rings fell from fingers. One panicked lord even dropped a scroll of diplomatic secrets into the chute. Some unlucky servant had to fish it out. With what? Don't ask. There are tales fringe and likely exaggerated of spies sneaking into castles via the garderobe shaft. It's possible the chutes were large enough, but you'd need a strong stomach, a lot of soap, and 0 sense of smell. Historians still argue about how regularly garderobes were cleaned. Some castles scheduled monthly clearings, others didn't. Archaeological digs have uncovered centuries of build-up beneath certain towers, complete with buttons, bones, pins, and ancient feces in unholy layers. One particularly grim find, a latrine in a ruined Scottish keep containing a desiccated leather shoe, perfectly preserved by the contents around it. You try not to imagine the foot that once filled it. As you descend again, you notice something else. A narrow channel carved into the stone floor, running from the garderobe toward the castle wall. This was part of a sluice system. Some castles used rainwater or buckets of river water to flush out the shafts now and then. It worked, partially, but, for all the engineering, the basic experience remained the same. Cold, loud, exposed. You couldn't talk to anyone through the garderobe. Door to windy. You couldn't light a candle for long, too dangerous. And heaven forbid you drop anything. Still, compared to the streets, it was a luxury. A private seat, a breeze, and a glorious downward chute that took your waist far. Far away from your nose, at least until the wind changed. You curl back up by the half now, the stone floor warm beneath your blanket. The last footsteps echo down the corridor. Somewhere, a servant empties a pot with a tired sigh. The castle sleeps, and so do you, because even in a fortress of stone and fire, someone still has to go to the toilet. Morning light creeps across the thatched roofs of a quiet monastery. Bells toll softly in the distance. You stretch, step into your sandals, and pull your rough wool robe tighter. It's time to visit the monks, because if there was one place in the medieval world that truly tried to master the toilet, it was the cloister. You shuffle through stone corridors, past chanting brothers and herb-filled gardens. At the edge of the complex stands a squat, narrow building, simple, sturdy, and humming faintly with flies. This, you realize, is the reredorter. That's the monastic latrine. The name comes from Latin, rea meaning behind, and dorter meaning dormitory. These latrines were always placed just behind the sleeping quarters, so monks could sneak in silently during the night. No noisy chamber pots here, no midnight courtyard squats, just a solemn hallway leading to an equally solemn bench. You step. Inside, it's oddly peaceful. A long stone room stretches before you, with a wide channel running beneath it, essentially an open sewer connected to a stream outside. Above the channel, a polished wooden beam with evenly spaced holes. The monks sit side by side here. No partitions, no privacy, just quiet cooperation. There's a kind of humility to it. Bodily needs were seen as universal, part of life's rhythm. No one mocked, no one stared. You did your business, wiped with moss or water, and left. Some even had running water. Channels diverted from nearby brooks flowed constantly beneath the benches, carrying waste away. For the 12th century, this was cutting-edge sanitation. Imagine that, a medieval flush system. Of course, not all monasteries had the same setup. Poorer ones used pits or even trenches in the garden. But the idea remained. The act of relieving yourself was part of your spiritual discipline. Cleanliness wasn't just practical, it was divine. You spot a row of jugs near the wall. These were for washing. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many European monks, demanded regular cleansing. After toileting, before prayer, after prayer, before meals. Hygiene was prayer in action. Still, not everything was holy. Accidents happened. One monk wrote about slipping on ice outside the latrine and falling in, nearly drowned in filth. He reports, yet rescued by the mercy of my brothers. Others recorded embarrassing sounds, strange smells, and one particularly vivid tale of a goose falling through the roof and landing in a monk's lap mid-defetizing. It was a place of contrasts, sacred and profane, silent and splattery, clean and definitely not. Monks also composted human waste for use in their vast gardens, mixed with straw, ash, and other organic scraps. It was carefully turned and tended. They may not have had microscopes, but they understood fertility. Crops thrived in soil well fed, as one herbal manual put it, and yet, even here, cleanliness had limits. Monasteries sometimes stank. Latrines backed up. Rats found their way in. And on rare occasions, monks were assigned latrine duty as penonscoping, scrubbing, and learning humility one bucket at a time. But for all its faults, the monastery latrine represents something extraordinary. An early system, order, routine, respect for the body. You rise from the bench, bow to a passing brother, and step back into the garden's sun. Even holiness, it turns out, needs a toilet. Now we turn to a place of silk robes, palace gardens, and tiny gold-inlaid slippers, the courts of the Islamic caliphates, from Cordoba to Baghdad, Damascus to Cairo. Islamic medieval cities had some of the most advanced sanitation in the world. If the average peasant in England was tossing waste out a window, the scholars of Andalusia were bathing daily, visiting purpose-built latrines, and discussing the theology of bowel etiquette. You find yourself in a tiled courtyard, fragrant with jasmine and orange blossoms. Beneath the shade of an arched gallery lies a small structure, modest, graceful, and practical. It's a toilet, but not just any toilet. It's built from white marble, set into a private room with a water channel. Nearby, there's a niche in the wall holding a brass pitcher, a tiny stool, and perfumed soap, and beside it, a beautifully etched inscription reminding users to wash their hands and thank God for the body's health. In Islamic cultures, cleanliness was not only hygienic, it was sacred. The hadiths, collections of the Prophet Muhammad's sayings and actions, contain specific instructions on how to relieve oneself, with which hand to wash, which foot to enter the toilet with, what to say before and after, and how much water to use. The result, a widespread tradition of toileting that prioritized cleanliness, modesty, and ritual. Water was central. Where in Europe people often wiped with cloth, moss, or straw, Muslims washed thoroughly with water, often using a small pot called a lotta or ibrik. Even travelers carried these vessels. Public toilets included water basins, and people were expected to wash after relieving themselves and before prayer. This wasn't just religious, it was structural. Cities like Baghdad had underground drains. Some neighborhoods piped water from aqueducts into private homes. Even rural villages maintained communal bathhouses with adjacent latrines. And then there's the paper. While toilet paper, as we know it, didn't exist, Islamic societies had early access to paper for writing and, occasionally, for hygiene. Certain regions, particularly around Cairo, produced rougher paper sheets that were used for medical or toilet-related purposes. One 10th century text mentions paper for use in the privy, not the library. Of course, not all was perfect. Outbreaks still occurred. Sewer systems clogged. Waste was sometimes dumped into canals. But compared to their European counterparts, these societies managed filth far more systematically. Historians still argue whether the spread of Islamic toilet customs influenced Christian Europe. Some say returning crusaders brought back the idea of washing with water. Others point to Sicily and southern Spain as conduits of hygiene. Either way, by the late Middle Ages, even some European nobles were installing water-friendly privies, and here you are, seated in quiet contemplation on a polished latrine bench, pouring a copper jug gently over your hands. The room smells faintly of rose oil. Outside, the call to prayer echoes across the courtyard tiles. You exhale. It's the cleanest you've felt in days. But what about the outcasts? What of the people who built these systems, cleaned them, and bore the brunt of a society's filth? It's time to meet the Gong farmers. The term alone deserves applause, and maybe a moment of silence. These were the brave, grimy souls tasked with emptying latrines, chamber pots, and cesspits across medieval towns. Their job, to climb down into the muck, shovel it into barrels, haul it through the streets, and dump it far from the city walls. You gag slightly just thinking about it. You spot one now, hauling a spade over his shoulder. He wears high leather boots, a long apron, and a face that says, "Yes, it's worse than it smells." His cart is filled with sealed wooden tubs, each sloshing ominously. He whistles as he works. Gong farmers often worked at night to avoid complaints. In London, laws banned them from operating during daylight hours. Some cities built night soil routes just for them. Their carts had bells, so people could brace themselves, saw shut their windows. The pay, surprisingly high. The danger, constant cesspits collapsed. Gases suffocated. Rats bit. Falls were common. There are reports of Gong farmers vanishing into pits, never to be seen again. Still, someone had to do it, and many did. Entire families, even generations of dung haulers, who kept medieval cities from drowning in their own waste. Some were respected, others were ostracized. Children threw stones at them. Priests refused to bless them. And yet without them, everything stopped. You nod as the farmer passes, and he nods back. Respect, because, in a world of fancy garderobes and gold-plated chamber pots, someone still had to carry it all away. Not every culture in medieval times followed the same script. Let's leave Europe now and wander east toward China, Korea, and Japan, where toilets took on forms you might find surprisingly familiar or deeply strange. In parts of Song dynasty, China, 10th–13th centuries, public latrines existed in cities, often with rudimentary plumbing. They were sometimes located near tea shops and bathhouses, with water channels underneath to carry away waste. Chinese agriculturalists also had a practical tradition. They wanted human waste. Known as night soil, it was collected and sold as fertilizer. Buckets were placed in outhouses, swapped out daily, and the contents carted away to farms. Even wealthy households often participated in the trade. What came out of the manor went into the melon patch. Japan took a similar route, particularly during the later Heian and Kamakura periods. Toilets were typically pit-style, located in small structures behind homes. Temples maintained communal latrines, and strict etiquette governed their use. Korean records show the use of outhouses with water flow systems near palaces, and evidence suggests rural families shared multi-seat setups, a bit like wooden reredorters, but outdoors. There's even an ancient Japanese proverb, "Do not scorn the man with a full bucket." You don't, not anymore. And now, as all things must, our toilet tours comes to an end. You've wandered through city alleys, crouched in fields, perched above castle moats, and sniffed the incense of a monastic latrine. You've wiped with moss, listened to the wisdom of a Gong farmer, and sat beneath the stars with only a pot and your dignity. And what have we learned? That in the Middle Ages, relieving yourself wasn't just a private act, it was a communal, architectural, religious, and economic puzzle. Every class had their method, every culture had its ritual, and every bum in every century still had to find a place to go. Historians still argue about many things: when sanitation truly improved, whether public health ever really declined after Rome, or how much dignity the average peasant could expect when squatting behind a hedge. But one thing is certain: no matter where or when you lived, toilet time was never just toilet time. It was politics, it was prayer, it was survival. You stand now in a quiet medieval field, wrapped in fog and moonlight, a pot in one hand, a jug of water in the other. The grass is wet beneath your feet. A cow blinks at you in the distance. You feel something strange, not disgust, not pity, but understanding. And now, with the latrines behind us and the candles burning low, it's time to rest. Let your shoulders soften. Let the breath slow down. You've traveled across centuries tonight, not with a sword, not with a crown, but with a chamber pot in hand and a quiet curiosity for the forgotten corners of history. You've seen how even the humblest moments, those whispered, smelly, awkward necessities, shaped the world we live in. From monks washing in silence, to peasants planting plum trees over filled pits, to noblewomen politely excusing themselves in embroidered privies, the story of medieval toilets is more than just mud and moss. It's a story of resourcefulness, survival, and the universal truth that no matter how different people may seem across time or space, everyone has to go eventually. So tonight, as you lie back in your bed, clean, warm, and far from any exploding garderobes, let that strange little truth settle in your chest like a lullaby. Maybe history isn't just battles and kings. Maybe it's also buckets and benches. The wind hums softly now. The past grows quiet, and somewhere in a stone tower, the last torch flickers out, leaving